So if this is the progress that we are looking at, and this is again the progress, quote and unquote progress. It's not progress at all. If you speak about in English terms, it's not progress at all. If this is the way in which our cities, our towns, our villages, our states, our nations are moving towards, we know what the crisis is at hand. And as I said, it's really scary. It should actually worry us, and very many ways with which this is certainly a concern. Everyone knows that. So what has happened is that there have been very many attempts in order to halt this crisis, stop this crisis, or at least lessen the crisis. And so one of the concepts that was developed was about sustainable development. Okay, sustainable development was a good concept, at least, suggesting that yes, there is a problem with the way in which development is going on, and that is why we need development, no doubt about that. We need access to a better lifestyle, and that comes through development. There's no doubt about that. But the present kind of a development is heading us right towards the environmental crisis, and therefore, what needs to be done is that at least, let's say, this development must be sustainable. And so this was, as many of you know, propounded by the Commission on Environment and Development much earlier. And then the definition was this. Can someone read this, please? Possibly a woman or a child, so that we have that. We have the sense of everyone participating. Can someone repeat?
Development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future generations to meet their own needs.
Thank you.
On Environment and Development, 1987.
Thank you very much. So it was a concession that was made. All right, we will have development, but that development should not, as they said, compromise future generations, which means that you can develop, but you should not steal from another generation, from a generation to come. Okay, in order to satisfy our needs, we should not steal from a further or a future generation, which was very good on paper, no doubt about that. It all looked fine. But we are to question this idea of sustainable development today. Why? Because the present development is not sustainable. How do we know it's not sustainable? It's because of these maps. The present idea of sustainable development is not happening. It's because of these evidences that we are getting, that the present development is not necessarily sustainable, nor sustainable development a useful concept, because it appears to be in English what we call as an oxymoron. Anyone knows what an oxymoron is? Oxymoron.
Statements.
Sorry, sir?
Opposite statements.
Absolutely. Thank you. When it's as if two opposite words are brought together. When two opposite words are brought together, and then it wants to make sense, that is how it is. We are asking the question, is it indeed not oxymoronic, sustainable and development? Because the present development is not simply sustainable. And so and that was the criticism that was brought against the concept of sustainable development by Lee, who said that it is extremely anthropocentric. Anthropocentric means?
Humans.
Yes, that's correct. Human-centered. Okay? That human beings are the center of the universe. Okay, sustainable development only looked at human beings and their quote and unquote development, which is not possible in the present schema. So what is the way in which one has to approach the environmental crisis? What are the ways? Are there any ways at all? And that's why, please forgive me if this is a little bit technical. I'll try and forewarn you about this. If it becomes too technical and the words are too heavy, please do let me know. I'll try my very best to actually simplify it. Epistemology simply means knowledge systems, where we get our knowledge from. What are the sources of knowledge? Do we get that from scientific sources? Do we get from our educational levels? Where do we get our knowledge from about the world? Okay, how do we know that there's an environmental crisis? Because we look at scientific evidences. Yes, perhaps our government is saying that there's a crisis at hand. Our schools and colleges, value education, or any other classes, they are informing. So where do we get the knowledge from? Is what is the question. And we can receive knowledge from two sources. One knowledge system, we call it dominant knowledge system, which means that it is a stronger knowledge system, and that knowledge comes from the more powerful ones, those who are in authority, those who hold a lot of wealth in our country and in our nations and in the world. Okay, we receive dominant knowledge from them. There's also a knowledge system which is called subversive. Dominant, subversive, or marginal. Marginal basically means those knowledge systems that we receive from the most vulnerable people, from the most poorest, those who live at the margins. So where do we get our knowledge system from? We need not guess it. We get the knowledge system more from the dominant because we have access to them and they have access to us. And that's why we need to decenter our knowledge system. Decenter simply means that we need to shift our attention in terms of where we receive the knowledge from. And right at the beginning, we need to know that there's a lot of knowledge violence against small communities, against the poor by the dominant. We call it let's say in philosophical and environmental terms, we call it epistemic violence. Epistemic violence basically means violence, knowledge violence that actually negates, that actually ignores systems that come from the poor, that their knowledge system is lower, their knowledge system, they do not have any knowledge at all. That's how we look at it, a perception because of our own stereotypes of what knowledge means for us. And that's why there's a lot of knowledge violence against what we call subaltern communities. Subaltern simply means subaltern or below the rank, rank, below the rank. Someone who is not in the level of what society expects as acceptable people, acceptable communities. And many of the big are, as I said, the richer ones. Epistemic violence. And this manifests in multiple forms, in which knowledge is denied. Wherever the knowledge that comes from the poor, that is what we call marginal communities, okay, that is often denied. And along with epistemic injustice, violence, there is what we call a cognitive injustice. Cognitive injustice simply means that the knowledge of, let's say, the Dalits, the Adivasis, or the tribals do not matter at all today. That is cognitive injustice, which means that their knowledge system is not up to the mark, is not acceptable, because we have all the scientific knowledge that we require. That is all is we are not denying scientific knowledge. Scientific knowledge is crucial, important in understanding the environmental crisis. But along with such knowledge, what we are to need is also a knowledge system that the poor would inform us. That is exactly our point today. And that's why the point about green movements. Green movement is a movement based at the heart of vulnerable communities, communities at the margins. And when we think about that, we would privilege Tuvalu people over against more powerful countries. That's exactly what it is. Yeah, we would privilege, let's say, Tuvalu people, what they are saying, we need to hear them. That's exactly the point. We need to see the cognitive justice of these communities. Okay, and that's why knowledge system is not simply mind oriented, what we call cerebral knowledge. What knowledge system is also means that there is also body mediated experience, we call it, which means that we need to listen to the suffering bodies and suffering earth. That's what it means. We need to be more attentive to the voices of those who actually undergo flood situations throughout the year, for that matter. We need to hear them. And the cry of the earth and the cry of those who live at the margins is very many times we need to hear those cries very precisely, because those voices are also the cry of the earth. And that's exactly what we are looking at. And that's why we need a new way of approaching community. Sorry, I'm putting bigger tones for us, but I'll try and simplify as much as possible so that we would know that we will not look at dominant sources. Dominant sources, as we said, are more that comes from powerful people, people who matter in society, people who are who actually head powerful industries in this country and this world. We are not listening, not saying that we don't listen to them, but we don't take their view of the environment. What we are to do is take the view of subaltern communities. That is the shift that we need to think about. That is a sense of repentance in Christian terms. We need to repent and look at places wherein which the voices and the power not always comes from Jerusalem. You know, we are just 1 week into Advent, just about preparing ourselves for Advent. And that's why we are not turning towards Jerusalem, the power center, we are turning towards Bethlehem, the powerless center, the marginal place, the subaltern place, the place of the poor, Bethlehem. That is our source. Jerusalem is not necessarily our source as we prepare for Advent, because Bethlehem is where the Savior is born, not in Jerusalem. And that is why we are to look at marginal sources, or what we call the oppositional gaze of the subaltern, the gaze of the poor, the voice of the poor do matter. Why does it matter? Because it's primary for us. And this body speaks about marginalization. It speaks about stigma. It speaks about exclusion. It speaks about death. And that's why the environmental crisis hits the poor the most. I'll say that again. The environmental crisis today hits the poor the most, because we can somehow survive the environmental crisis as of now. Today, since I'm here, I have the access to the good sweater, and so I wear that. I'm secure in the four walls, and so I do not feel the bitter cold outside. If it is too hot, we actually have ACs in our own places, and that's what keeps us cooler, and so we are not touched by it. But who are the most touched because of the environmental crisis are the poorest in our communities, and certainly the earth. The cry of the earth and the cry of the poor are to be listened to, because that hits them directly, because they are at the forefront of the environmental crisis today. And that's why it's so important that the lived experience, or what we call the body mediated experience of these, are to be listened to. And that's why it's a beautiful suggestion by a very powerful social theorist today, called Horkheimer, who says that the misery of the victim is thus the point of departure. What does this mean? The misery of the victim. Um, for any crisis to be understood, we need to listen, or we need to look at who is hurt the most, who suffers the most. And it's important for us because we actually worship a crucified God in the Lord Jesus Christ. And that is why we need to look at who suffers the most in any crisis, for that matter. And only through that lens we can understand who are suffering the most. The misery of the victim is thus the point of departure for any conversation, for that matter. That's exactly what we are looking at. And there is a video, but there is I'm looking at the time, and so we have a few minutes to go. I'll try and put this video for us. This is about a company. Reverend Vinod Victor, who was doing the Bible study earlier, was speaking about how industries are taking over the lives of people. How industries are taking over the lives of people, and he specifically mentioned one part of the industry. If you would have listened to that carefully, I'm not going to say that, but possibly this will shed light on that. So the first video is about a little advertisement about this company and what the company is doing for the most poorest. So I hope you can get to see this.
Vedanta, a company that reaches out to people. Vedanta is a company that takes special care to enhance the quality of life of the communities around its area of operations. Our principal focus is on improved livelihood programs, health, education, and overall development of the local communities. Simultaneously, we understand our responsibility towards the environment from which we draw our resources. The indigenous tribes of Kalahandi district, like the Dongriya Kantha and the Kutiya Kantha, with their unique cultures and breathtaking environment, are close to Vedanta's heart. We respect their individuality and realize the need to preserve their rich cultural heritage, along with implementing various development programs. We are committed to protect their lifestyle, their culture, their needs and aspirations as we walk hand in hand with them. We have learned that tradition and growth can coexist in a peaceful and harmonious manner.
Okay, you saw this particular video of a company speaking about what and all they are doing. So if you look at how this particular video was shot, did people speak in this video?
No, sir. No.
No.
And
What were the expressions that you found of those people? Were they happy? Were they very sad? Or were they happy?
they're happy, sir.
Yeah, extremely happy. That's correct. All these pictures, still pictures, we call it, and no one speaking from the other side. The company is saying that the people are happy. They are providing for all their needs, and then they're doing everything for the environment, so everything is fine. And as we say, in any of the fairy tale ending, how do we end the fairy tale?
Happily
ever after. Thank you, that's right. And they lived happily ever after. And they lived happily ever after. So this is one side of the story, and this is exactly where we need to sense where we get our knowledge system from. Do we get our knowledge system from the dominant who is explaining what they are doing for the environment, or in the previous slide of what we said, are we looking or are we wanting to hear the side of the victim? The side of the subaltern, the side of the marginal, rather than the dominant. And that's why we need to listen to what they're actually saying. And I'll try, because of paucity of time, I'll try and forward this video to you through Dr. Koshi, but we'll try and get a glimpse of the other side of the story, if it's all right.
One of India's most remote tribes, a mountain they revere as a god, and a multinational mining company with its sights set on the mountain's sacred stone. The stage is set for a bitter struggle against the backdrop of eastern India's dramatic landscapes. As the bulldozers draw closer, what will one tribe do to save their forest, their mountains, and their god?
I'll try and forward that to you because of the time constraint. I'll try and forward that. Let's see. What is basically happening is that this company takes over their land and their forest, and then they build an entire structure, and they simply take over the villages, just like that, and ask them to move where they cannot. And then the people say that everything is dusted. There's absolutely no way in which they can live. And that's why what they're doing is that they want to protest. And that's what they're saying. Yeah. And check this. Okay. So they're saying people are getting agitated and okay. Let's listen.
And so the Dongrias have blocked the roads into their sacred hills. They're not waiting for their fate to be decided in a corporate boardroom.
Amaro Niamgiri Pahado Swimbo Katrakarnai. Our bank Golibi or bank Golibi, Mundo Golibi Machadabune, say parlous. Sorry, I'm a part. And Reta would Ataiva and Tervetergena Teru, Saribis in Dolo Naturabedana, Ekota Katakianga, Marabikino, it's Madela Manbene, Ma Rajataki Maromano, Madesaki Marotino. You stand out and try to breathe. The air will calm you down. Moi seta jebbi nai to kuare golle bi mote paasi korle koro morle moro bujle bujo amaro agre tilla semti eka ebbe agre kemti tilla sono gartillu ebbe bi sono garo tapiku. You can run away from me. Nothing's gonna change. You can hide yourself from me. I'll see you anywhere. Kobi logo balik nanele tibu. Jati gote jono kette kate kondor logo kichu jono bandi par deki police wala kette dina roibi. Police wala kette dina mote bandi kina rakte baso debbe na maso kai kina roibi baso kai kina roibi yo logo bandi karna nele tibi
କେତେ ଦିନ ରହିଲେ ସେଠି ରହିବି ଆମର ଜୀବନ ନ ଛାଡ଼ି ନ ମରଲା ଯାଏ ଆମର ଛାଣୁ ଆମର ଜାତିକା ଆମର ନିୟମର ଜାତି ଛାଡ଼ିକି ନା
କେତେ ଆମର ଆଦିବାସୀ ହଉ କି ଆମର ଆପଣ ଆଜ୍ଞା ମାନେ ସମସ୍ତେ ଆମର ସାହିତ୍ୟ ମିଶିବାର ପଡ଼ିବ ବେଦାଙ୍କୁ କେତେବାର ପଡ଼ିବ
Okay, thank you for your patience in thinking about this. It's deeply troubling, and one of you has said that in down south of Tamil Nadu, a similar thing has happened. The question that we have asked is, where do we get our knowledge from? Do we get knowledge from dominant communities which say that they are doing all the good things for the environment, what they call as sustainable development? Or are we listening to the cry of the earth or the cry of the people who actually go through this crisis? One thing that we have to mention about this particular industry was that the biggest investor in this company was a church body, a broad church body. So it was a bit of a surprise that a church body had put all its pension funds and other funds to actually to be invested in this company. And because of deliberations, we hear that they actually disinvested, which means that they got their money back with a lot of loss, of course. But that's the stand that one is doing. That is exactly where green movements are to come in. What is green movement? That is what we are looking at. What is social and green movements? This is a crisis at hand. Until now, what I'll try and summarize what we had to do. We started with preliminary questions, if you remember, asking how worried are we about the present and the future of the earth, and also can green movements in any way come to the aid of climate change? That's the question that we were posing right at the beginning. And then we proceeded by saying that we need to what we call decenter knowledge systems, which means that where we get our knowledge about the environment from, or the environmental crisis from. And we began by suggesting that we are to change our way of listening not to powerful dominant sources, but what we call subaltern marginal sources. And that is why the green movement is what is the green movement? What it does right at the beginning is that it looks at 3 or 4 categories. Let's say class, caste, gender, sexuality, or power crisis. Okay, who holds the power in society? That's exactly what it determines right at the beginning. And then there are very many examples of the social movements that we are to know that actually come from the most poorest of society. So the video that you saw, the second video, was from the Adivasi community in Orissa or Odisha, called the Dongriya Kond community. And that is a green movement. That's a social movement. And so there are 2 kinds of green movements. One is what we call micro green movement. Micro green movements is where local communities take initiative to speak about the environment. Let's say children in school, very important. Micro communities speaking about the environment. And the CSI Synod in the Ecological Concerns Department, headed by Professor Dr. Matthew Koshi, has done human service, given human service to the way in which schools have been conceived as green spaces, and how they're named as green ambassadors who speak about ecology and the ecological crisis. Those can be termed as micro green movements. There's also macro green movements, which means larger green movements. And we begin with the larger green movements today. And those examples can be very many, which means that green movements are organized movements, what we call people's movements, where people without any political power, they can come together to think about the environment and to struggle for the environment. And some of these examples, some of you might know this, some of you may not know this. Some of the examples of the Changara land struggle or Chengara land struggle, we'll speak about that in a moment. Chipko movement, Narmada Bachao Andolan, very many Dalit movements, Adivasi movements, anti-war movements, tribal movements. These are bigger movements wherein which powerless people come together to speak about the environment. And elsewhere in the world, we have very many examples of inspiring green movements. In saving wildlife in Zambia, certainly the Environmental Justice Networking Forum in South Africa. Some of you may know this, okay? The Tafo movement in Madagascar, and the environmental movement which is in Kiribati. Kiribati is the letters, but I think Kiribati is the way in which they pronounce. Environmental Foundation of Jamaica, the Green Movement of Sri Lanka, and certainly the Save Happy Valley Coalition in New Zealand. And if you look at all these countries, in these countries, powerless people from the margins, people from what we call subaltern communities, the indigenous people, coming together to form a coalition. And what they are asking is for churches to partner together, to stand with them in their own struggle to save the environment. And these are some of the movements. Of course, the Chengara land struggle is a long struggle in Kerala, which is apparently still ongoing. And certainly the Chipko movement, some of you would know, and certainly schools are being taught about this, in which inspiring protests by women saved the entire forest. And Narmada Bachao Andolan, of course, Medha Patkar's long-drawn struggle, and it's still continuing in the Narmada Valley as we speak today, that people are struggling for this. So these are, and that's why it's so important that Christian ethics really needs to take the side of the poor, the oppressed, and what Dussel calls it, their project of salvation. Their project of salvation basically means that salvation is as much as it's spiritual, it is also the healing of people. And that's exactly what our Savior Jesus did. Jesus not only proclaimed salvation as grace, Jesus actually healed people. Jesus was together in their struggles, together, not always in the power centers. And that's why Jesus was in Galilee most of the time, not necessarily in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, he was actually crucified. It is in these places that Jesus served. His leg touched the dusty grounds of ancient Israel all the time. And that's exactly what Christian ethics is called to do. And green movements, people's movements, social movements are what we call counter hegemonic praxis. Well, this is a big word. What it basically means that it stands opposite to the powerful. It stands opposite to everything that colonizes people, colonizes the forest, colonizes the land, colonizes the water. What we call robbing the commons. Robbing the commons basically means that it is stealing the forest, the water, and the land. And micro movements are extremely important. Engaging young people, especially children, in the environmental or the ecological dialogue. Small children's club programs, children's voices being acknowledged. And that's why the CSI has been so inspiring in bringing children, what we call micro green movements, right to the forefront in our own country and in the way in which churches are to engage with it. Just about 5 minutes that we have left of this, and that is why children are to be and will be sensitized constantly on taking up issues of climate change. And the CSI has recently produced a wonderful children's book on the environment, and I'm sure that you would still have access to that wonderful resource that has been put forward or put together by the Church of South India, the Ecological Concerns Department, and being children as agents of change, and what they call green ambassadors of change in communities. And the new social movements are very many, and it requires a lot of perspectives that are drawn. And what is at the center of this is this. It's the politics of water, forest, and the land. Jal Jungle or Jameen, we call it. Jal Jungle or Jameen. Water, forest, and the land at the heart of this, of the green movements. And what we are to look at is this. There are small things, just because of the paucity of time, just about 4 minutes that we have. Dear friends, sisters and brothers, children, youngsters who are listening to this, who are right here, we need to think about certain shifts that we need to make. A change in perspective, a change in the way in which we have come to see the environmental crisis, the ecological crisis at hand, because we are to overcome the danger of familiarity today, familiarity of the subject, because what familiarity does is it creates an aura, an insulation all around us that it doesn't affect us anymore. It does affect us. That's why we need to make proposals. The ecological issue or ecological crisis is not simply an environmental issue. It is a justice issue. We need to make this clear to all of us. That the ecological crisis is not simply an environmental crisis. Okay, we can manage that. But it is an issue of justice. Justice to the most vulnerable, subaltern, marginal people today, as well as the subaltern earth, the marginalized earth today. Earth justice. And therefore, we need to think about a way of a shift from simply speaking about climate change to climate justice. That climate needs justice today. And we need to shift our identity, our thinking from what we call sustainable development, which is not necessarily sustainable today, to what we call sustainable life or sustainable lives. We need to sustain lives today. Life of the most vulnerable people and the vulnerable earth. We also need to a little shift between what we call stewardship. You know, stewardship is a good term, no doubt about it. We need to be stewards of the earth, we are told. It's a good word. But as stewards, we still have power and someone is underneath. You know, steward also has a certain sense of power over. And that's why we need to move away from using stewardship to what we call kinship, bonding, partnership with the earth and earth communities. And that's what green movements teach us, to move away from what we call stewardship of the earth to to more kinship of the earth. K-I-N, it's not K-I-N-G, kingship. It's kin, kith and kin, relationality, partnership. And we need to further discourse from also from tree planting, which is very important, to recovering, preserving biodiversity. That's very important. We may plant very many trees, but if we start taking off biodiverse areas, we can never replace them, because biodiversity comes from millions and millions and millions of years. We cannot replace them. We can plant trees, but we can never replace biodiversity. And that's why, as much as we plant trees, we need to preserve all the biodiverse places that are there. And then a final, most importantly, perspective from subaltern communities, people from the margins. Because as we said, as Horkheimer says, the misery of the victim is the point of departure, or the misery of the victim is our starting point in the discussion. And we need to be very careful. We try and provide realistic alternatives and join the green movements that are already in place, both micro level, as we say, children participating in the environmental movements, as well as macro green movements, wherein which the most marginalized communities around the world are joining hands together in order to form a coalition that will seek to protect the earth. Thank you very much, friends, for sisters and brothers, children, for these opportunities. Exactly just 1 minute past 9:30, and it's time for us. I think it's just crossing through our schedule for our rest. And so, thank you very much, Dr. Koshi. Over to you.